From the beginning of the war, Germany built its strategy relying on air dominance. The Luftwaffe expanded rapidly, convinced that no country would equal its preparation nor its speed of deployment. For its commanders, the United States was a slow, clumsy industrial power dedicated to manufacturing consumer goods without experience in global conflicts. The distance, internal politics, and its apparent weakness were sufficient reasons to rule it out as a real rival. Berlin did not prepare to face a nation capable of converting civilian production lines into large-scale war factories. They did not anticipate the massive arrival of bombers nor the constant appearance of new models. When the United States aircraft began to arrive in waves, German territory ceased to be a safe zone. The cities, the factories, and the fronts were relentlessly struck. The sky ceased to belong to them. German response capability collapsed, and with it, thousands of lives. None of that was foreseen from the beginning. What was the real cost of underestimating the industrial power of the United States? When the Reich laughed at America. During the years leading up to the outbreak of the war, the German regime's leadership maintained a distorted perception of what the United States represented as an industrial nation. In the halls of power, the idea was repeated that that distant country, dominated by financial interests and a mixture of races, lacked the discipline, unity, and strategic vision necessary to compete in the military field. The prevailing image was that of a consumerist, individualistic, and deeply divided society, incapable of sustaining a prolonged effort in the event of a global conflict. That contempt did not arise from improvisation. It was fueled by years of speeches, internal reports, and ideological prejudices. There was talk of factories that mass-produced useless objects, of chaotic cities where no one obeyed superior orders, and of a poorly educated youth, lacking physical preparation or the spirit of sacrifice. The opinions arriving from Berlin were clear. The United States had neither the will nor the moral structure to become a real war power. Despite its size and resources, it was considered a clumsy giant trapped in its own capitalist excesses. In the economic field, the analysis followed the same line. In the eyes of German planners, the American economy was unstable and prone to crises. The effects of the financial collapse of 1929 still resonated, and in power circles it was repeated that that country depended too much on its exports, foreign credit, and chaotic production based on internal consumption. According to this view, the North American industrial structure lacked centralized direction, which, in times of war, would translate into a total inability to reconvert itself to the service of armament. In contrast, within German territory, a completely different model was extolled. The economy was under state control, oriented towards rearmament for years, and was presented as an example of efficiency, planning, and national sacrifice. The statistics were shown with pride: kilometers of roads constructed, tons of steel melted, accelerated production of heavy weaponry. Every report reinforced the idea that Germany had found the formula to prevail both on the battlefields and in the factories and logistics centers. That internal confidence was also fueled by a strong ideological component. Official doctrine asserted that only homogeneous peoples, led by a strong elite, were capable of achieving large-scale collective goals. Within that framework, the United States represented the exact opposite: a mixed-race nation without common roots, managed by economic interests and not by convictions. Its social model was considered weak, contaminated by decadent values, and lacking the capacity to unite millions of people under the same purpose. Even the most technical sectors of the regime shared that limited vision. Comparisons between industrial training systems were constant, and they always favored the German model. It was highlighted that German workers were trained from a young age to perform specialized functions, while Americans frequently changed jobs without acquiring deep skills. Internal reports spoke of distracted workers, problematic unions, and a labor culture marked by improvisation. The conclusions drawn from those perceptions were stark. If a direct confrontation ever occurred, it was taken for granted that the United States would take years to start up its machinery. Even in the best-case scenario, it was believed that it couldn't match the pace of production of a fully mobilized authoritarian state. The country's capacity to reorganize itself, coordinate efforts among diverse sectors, or transform its civil industries into engines of war was underestimated. Meanwhile, the news arriving from across the Atlantic reinforced that idea of inaction and lack of preparation. The years of the so-called American isolationism, marked by a passive foreign policy and a public opinion reluctant to get involved in international conflicts, were interpreted as a sign of structural weakness. For German strategists, that distancing was explained by a cultural inability to face global challenges, rather than a tactical decision. As the European conflict approached, the few mentions of the United States air capability were superficial. The existence of some civil companies, scattered factories, and a small air force that had barely participated in real exercises was known. In the German military high echelons, the growth of certain North American technological sectors was deliberately ignored, and the focus was preferred on models that had not yielded outstanding results in previous wars. From the propaganda machine, the idea that the real enemy was on the European continent was constantly reinforced. France was spoken of as a historical rival, the United Kingdom as a strategic obstacle, and the Soviet Union as the long-term goal. In that context, the United States barely appeared as a secondary threat, more symbolic than real, incapable of projecting sustained power across the ocean. That perception also translated to aeronautical production. Although it was known that companies capable of building airplanes existed, it was assumed that their methods were rudimentary and their products inferior. The German obsession with design, advanced engineering, and precision materials fueled the conviction that no other country would reach their level. Prototypes were shown with sophisticated systems, innovative engines, and exclusive navigation technologies, as if that were enough to make a difference in a global conflict. At the same time, the idea of building in series or using simplified assembly lines was scorned. The North American production model, based on large volumes and standardized parts, was considered vulgar and unrefined. For the regime's leaders, quality could only be achieved through specialized work and direct supervision, not through automated factories or workers without technical training. The strategic value of decentralization was also not understood. The American industrial structure, spread across multiple states, with extensive railway networks and distributed resources, was seen as a logistical obstacle, instead of an advantage in case of bombings or interruptions. In contrast, Germany concentrated its production in specific nuclei, believing that this facilitated control and efficiency, without foreseeing the risks that this entailed. In short, the contempt towards the United States was not limited to a miscalculation, but was part of a closed worldview based on internal myths and an exaggerated valuation of their own achievements. The regime trusted that in the event that that country entered the war, it would do so belatedly, poorly coordinated, and without a solid structure behind it. That assumption, maintained for years without critical review, would be the starting point for a major surprise that would completely change the balance of the conflict. When the German commanders evaluated American air power, they did so based on their own experience with the Luftwaffe. That force, built with urgency and perfected throughout the Spanish Civil War and the first years of the European conflict, was seen by its leaders as an advanced, precise, and highly professional tool. In contrast to this, the reports arriving from America described a fragmented air force with antiquated plane models and training considered lax. That comparison fueled the certainty that there was no real threat across the Atlantic. In the technical analyses, data circulated about slow fighters, bombers with limited range, and an aeronautical industry that barely supplied the civil market. The statistics discussed in Berlin pointed to small figures for monthly production, factories with scarce militarized personnel, and a poorly articulated logistical chain. The officers in charge of collecting that information concluded that even if the United States decided to increase its manufacturing, it would take too long to adapt to the rhythm of a large-scale war. That confidence remained unchanged even after the first movements in the Pacific. The immediate effects of the attack on Pearl Harbor were surprising in their magnitude, but did not alter the general perception. German planners considered that the North American effort would concentrate exclusively on Asia, and that its resources would be consumed by the distance, the type of terrain, and the difficulty of supplying prolonged naval operations. It was believed that the attrition in that region would impede any serious intervention in Europe. In the high command offices, attention remained focused on the eastern and western fronts of the continent. The maps were filled with arrows, divisions, and objectives around cities, ports, and land routes. The possibility that an external power could intervene from the air with effective range was quickly dismissed. Geography played in favor of that belief. It was assumed that no North American bomber could reach the cities of the Reich without stopping at multiple layovers, exposing themselves to countermeasures, attrition, and mechanical problems. Furthermore, the Luftwaffe production model adhered to a completely different logic. Airplanes were manufactured in limited series, with high technical standards and under the direct supervision of military engineers. Each unit was conceived for specific missions, adjusted to the European terrain, and aligned with fast attack doctrines. In contrast, what they knew about the North Americans spoke of standardized models, repeated components, and massive assemblies carried out by non-specialized workers. For the German strategists, that system could only generate aircraft that were theoretically functional, but fragile and inefficient in the real field. That conclusion was not just on paper. In the regime's instruction centers and academies, it was taught that air supremacy would come from talent, technical training, and discipline. German pilots were subjected to rigorous processes, trained for months, and selected from the best physical and intellectual profiles. In contrast, the idea was spread that North American aviators were recruited quickly, with brief training and without a demanding filter. That narrative reinforced the idea that any air offensive from America would be chaotic and poorly executed. Neither was understood the organizational approach that was being developed in the United States. The North American model relied on an open collaboration among private companies, government agencies, and military structures. That mixture, viewed from Germany, seemed disorganized, prone to conflicts of interest, and lacking central command. It was unknown that that very scheme would allow enormous flexibility to adapt production, transfer capabilities from one industry to another, and multiply the delivery of units in increasingly shorter terms. In the regime's internal debates, specific concerns arose, but they were quickly minimized. Some report warned about the growth of engine factories in certain industrial cities of the American East, or about the reconversion of automotive plants into bomber assembly centers. However, those signs were classified as exaggerated or out of context. It was said that even if the United States began to produce on a larger scale, it would never reach the levels of precision or the speed that the regime demanded of its own manufacturers. Official propaganda continued to reinforce that image of superiority. In the state-controlled media, images were broadcast of the German aviation operating on various fronts, destroying enemy columns, flying over fortified positions, and demonstrating synchronized maneuvers. They were presented as the example of a perfect machine which combined technology, courage, and combat experience. In contrast, only scenes of airplanes on the ground, training photographs, or civilian sequences were shown of the American side, without any powerful propaganda effect. In parallel, the contempt also extended to the use of women in the war industry. The images arriving from America, showing thousands of female workers incorporated into factories, operating heavy machinery or assembling complex parts, were interpreted as a sign of structural weakness. In the regime's mindset, only exhausted nations resorted to that type of labor force. It was not understood that that decision would allow a huge number of men to be freed up for combat, while the rhythm of production was maintained intact. Another underestimated point was the logistical capacity. Germany had built a structure oriented towards short range, with internal railway networks, centralized factories, and intensive land transport. It was believed that this organization was sufficient to sustain any European front. In contrast, American decentralization was viewed as a disadvantage, without considering that that same dispersion would protect their facilities from bombings, facilitate simultaneous production in different states, and allow the rapid mobilization of resources in case of need. That lack of understanding persisted even when signs of expansion began to arrive. In internal meetings, mention was made of the massive contracts signed by certain companies, the creation of strategic air routes, and the accelerated construction of airfields in remote locations. Even so, it was claimed that that deployment was not sustainable over time, that it would eventually collapse under the weight of its own improvisation. That initial certainty would prevent precautions from being taken against what was to come. Most of the German command remained attached to their mental model. More value was placed on previous combat experience than on future projection. Priority was given to technical quality over quantity. They trusted in the tactical superiority of experienced squadrons, while ignoring that in a prolonged war, what would make the difference would be the capacity for constant replacement, the availability of parts, and uninterrupted production. Towards the end of 1941, when some voices began to insist that North American industry was advancing with concrete steps, those warnings did not modify the general strategy. The war remained focused on the East, resources were directed to the active campaigns, and the view of the United States remained distant, tinged with prejudice, miscalculations, and a deeply rooted arrogance. That strategic blindness would seal many wrong decisions in the following years. By then, plans were already underway that, from scattered factories, unprecedented assembly lines, and an unparalleled logistical network, would begin to transform what until that moment seemed like a dormant nation into the most feared industrial power on the planet. The initial contempt would soon turn into concern, and that unease would grow into an operational nightmare for all the commands that had previously mocked what they considered impossible. The first signs of the giant. During the first months of 1942, the German command officers began to receive the first fragmented reports about a growing factory activity across the Atlantic. Until that moment, the idea that the North Americans could reorganize their entire economy to sustain a global war seemed like an exaggeration or a propaganda calculation. But what was initially considered an anecdotal phenomenon began to generate unease in certain military offices, where the numbers regarding shipments, heavy machinery, and transports began to exceed the margins of what had been assumed. As German factories struggled to keep up with the pace of production due to the restrictions imposed by bombings and the scarcity of raw materials, the contrast with the emerging figures from the United States began to be perceived with a hint of discomfort. On the Atlantic coast, German submarines detected an anomalous increase in merchant ships sailing in convoy, protected by escorts and patrol planes. It was the first real symptom that the country's industrial machinery was starting up. From the Reich's hangars, German observers noted that the models of enemy planes were changing in design and quantity. Where small and dissolved formations were previously seen, now numerous squadrons appeared, acting in coordination with ground and naval forces. Even without having yet suffered large-scale direct attacks on its main cities, the German High Command understood that something was changing in the scale of the war. Meanwhile, reports arriving in Berlin from observers located in neutral nations began to show a disturbing scene. Cargo trains circulated without pause, full of military vehicles, assembled engines and metal structures freshly produced from expanding industrial plants. On different fronts, Allied forces were deploying equipment that had barely been registered weeks ago, which evidenced a capacity to respond that unsettled several Reich commanders. The accelerated installation of production centers, the synchronized use of resources, and the organized incorporation of civilian personnel indicated a much faster pace of adaptation than anticipated. Although alarming statements were still avoided, military officers began to privately review their previous calculations with increasing caution. One of the aspects that caused the most bewilderment among German analysts was the speed with which American planes began to populate the different fronts. What were previously limited figures transformed into production volumes that exceeded any previous expectation. When studying the recovered fragments of aircraft shot down in North Africa or over the English Channel, German technicians observed manufacturing patterns that demonstrated highly advanced standardization with interchangeable parts and uniform finishes. That reflected not only a quantitative increase, but a methodological implementation that eliminated intermediate steps and allowed assembly times to be reduced without compromising technical performance. Even so, in the staff meetings, alarming terms were avoided. It was preferred to attribute the increase to a momentary peak, a logistical boost linked to an initial stage of the Allied war effort. Internal propaganda insisted that quality remained on the German side, and that no increase in quantity could compensate for the technological precision of the Reich's weaponry. However, in military calculation centers, simulations began to reflect an increasingly smaller margin of superiority in the scenarios projected for the following year. The possibility that the Allied air forces would equal the number of the Reich's squadrons began to be included as a possible variable in campaign estimates. In parallel, a significant change occurred in the attitude of certain commanders operating in France, Norway, and the Balkans. As European ports began to be bombed more frequently by planes originating from England, many of them marked with newly introduced symbols, the perception of the enemy changed. What was initially considered a clumsy, slow and predictable adversary now began to demonstrate a much faster capacity for adaptation than imagined. Patrol routes had to be adjusted, fuel reserves were reorganized, and troop movements were carried out with greater caution given the growing possibility of sustained enemy air cover. German factories, for their part, experienced contrary pressures. With limited resources and labor increasingly difficult to replace, engineers were forced to reduce margins of error without having enough time to conduct complete tests. The most modern models required special materials whose procurement was becoming more complicated. In that context, the news about the American capacity to standardize components, exchange them between different models, and reduce assembly times to a fraction of what a factory in Leipzig or Vienna took was difficult to process. The idea that a country without a tradition of war could surpass the German war industry in speed and volume was uncomfortable even for the most pragmatic. Among certain Luftwaffe commands, reports began to circulate about the possible development of new aerial models in Allied territory, though without conclusive details. The sources were vague and often contradictory, which generated more doubts than answers. Some technicians suggested that the enemy might be testing variants of aircraft with greater autonomy or resistance, but those conjectures were quickly dismissed as unrealistic. The German operational focus remained anchored in the assumption that any deep attack would require intermediate stops or support, and consequently existing plans were not adjusted. In the German pilot training fields, some instructors began to comment on the need to adapt to a more aggressive rhythm of squadron rotation. They did so with discretion, but with a concerned tone. Experience was no longer enough. What was needed was volume, constant replacements, and an infrastructure capable of sustaining long campaigns. In that aspect, the United States had taken an unexpected lead. They had managed to train thousands of young people in simulators, intensive training and automated processes, something that Germany could only partially imitate due to the lack of resources. On the diplomatic front, German ambassadors in neutral countries began to send more detailed communications about the atmosphere in the United States. There was talk of a society that had turned almost entirely to war production. The queues in the shipyards, the factories operating at night, the massive participation of women on assembly lines, all of this composed a different image from the one the Reich propagandists continued to sell internally. Contrary to what was expected, the enemy was not dispersing in internal discussions or fragmenting into political fights. On the contrary, it seemed to have cohesive around a common objective. Although the tone of the reports remained moderate, some paragraphs began to suggest that previous calculations might be wrong. The predictions that had estimated a limited participation of the United States in the war now seemed naive. The most optimistic projections, which assumed that that country would be limited to logistical tasks, were already discarded even by the most conservative analysts. What was being faced now was something else, a power that, when mobilized, did so on a scale that Europe was not prepared to match. During the summer of 1942, the signs that the strategic balance was shifting began to be noticed in the intelligence reports gathered by the Reich offices. The estimates on the pace of enemy plane production had to be urgently updated, as the previous numbers no longer matched the actual quantity of aircraft appearing in European skies. Although in some sectors it was still believed that the Allies were largely dependent on British material, the license plates of the captured fuselages, the manufacturing codes and the technical analyses made it clear that the United States was manufacturing on its own, at an accelerated pace, and in proportions that exceeded expectations. On the coasts of North Africa, where the German army was sustaining an increasingly complex campaign, enemy air squadrons began to show an unusual frequency of appearance. What had been sporadic in other campaigns was now systematic. The constant air cover allowed enemy forces to organize logistical movements during the day without fear of attacks from the air. That advantage, although not decisive by itself, modified the behavior of the German troops, who were forced to move during less efficient hours and under unfavorable conditions. Tactical mobility, until then one of the German army's strengths, was reduced in part due to the growing power of the enemy wings. The high command authorities began to receive reports about American factories that were producing several airplane models in parallel, each aimed at a specific type of mission. The variety and specialization of these aircraft, surprised those who still assumed that the Allies relied on generic, poorly optimized designs. There were fast fighters, long-range bombers, transport planes, escorts and reconnaissance aircraft, all coming out in mass from facilities scattered across the country. This capacity for diversification in the middle of a war turned out to be one of the points that most worried the German strategists. The consequences were soon felt on the western fronts. Occupied ports began to receive more frequent and better coordinated air attacks. Warehouses, railway centers, and fuel deposits were no longer hit with isolated missions, but within organized campaigns aimed at interrupting the flow of supplies. These bombings not only generated material damage, but also caused delays that affected the morale of the fighters. The sense of superiority that had predominated during the first years of the war began to dissipate in some sectors. Inside the Reich, the aeronautical industry had to respond to this new scenario, but its conditions were far from favorable. Factories suffered from structural limitations, and Allied bombings began to leave more visible marks. Relocating facilities to less exposed regions required time and resources, two elements that were already scarce. Production managers were forced to prioritize certain models, reducing the diversity of designs and concentrating efforts on keeping a fleet operational that was beginning to show signs of wear. Replacements did not arrive at the same pace as losses, and the quality of the new aircraft suffered the consequences of the haste. While the German commands tried to update their operation maps, they began to detect alterations in the usual trajectories of enemy formations. Some routes showed more direct and sustained approach patterns, which indicated that new refueling zones were being employed or that Allied planes were gaining operational autonomy. Although the information was still partial, it was assumed that the enemy was beginning to explore more efficient ways of maintaining constant pressure from the air on key targets without requiring extensive pauses between missions. In several meetings of the Luftwaffe technical personnel, the possibility of developing specific countermeasures to deal with the new situation was discussed. Improvements in anti-aircraft artillery, adjustments in patrol routes, and redesigns in early warning systems were proposed. However, many of these initiatives remained stalled due to the impossibility of manufacturing them in time or the lack of adequate components. Unlike the enemy, who could count on an almost unlimited reserve of resources, the German officials had to operate under constant restrictions. The flight instructors, for their part, warned that the training periods for new pilots were becoming increasingly brief. The pressure to send more men to the airfront reduced the time dedicated to training, which affected combat performance. At the same time, the planes arriving from the plants required more maintenance and adjustments before they could be used, which delayed their deployment. That combination of fatigue, scarcity, and haste generated a difficult circle to break. The Reich's air forces maintained some control in key sectors, but the general trend began to tilt. As the year advanced, the accumulation of evidence on the American industrial mobilization forced German planners to review their strategic maps. It was internally recognized that the number of planes the enemy could manufacture in 1 year exceeded the totality of the active German air fleet. That implied that in a prolonged scenario, attrition would not play in favor of the Reich. Resistance depended increasingly on defensive measures, while the enemy gained strength with increasing offensive capability. One of the key moments occurred when a flotilla of enemy bombers managed to reach targets in areas previously considered safe, without suffering significant casualties. The precision of the attack, combined with the number of aircraft employed, made it clear that it was not an exceptional operation. It was a pattern in formation. The psychological impact of that action extended beyond the physical damage. For the first time, many within the German military apparatus accepted that air supremacy was now in dispute, and that this dispute would not be resolved only with tactical maneuvers, but with volume, persistence, and recovery capacity. In the midst of that context, official propaganda maintained an optimistic discourse. There was talk of technological advances, of new weapons under development, of engineers preparing revolutionary solutions. However, less confident phrases began to appear in the internal reports. Bottlenecks were mentioned, unforeseen delays, and a growing tension in the supply chain. While the enemy managed to shorten the times between design, testing, and production, German factories stagnated on models that no longer offered decisive advantages. During the last months of 1942, the change became evident to those who analyzed the numbers without ideological filters. The volume of American air transport, the deployed logistics, and the preparation for large-scale operations could no longer be ignored. The initial predictions about a short or contained war vanished. What was approaching was a phase of total industrial confrontation, where the capacity to replace and multiply resources would be as important as tactical talent or the experience of the soldiers. And in that terrain, the first symptoms showed that the balance was no longer tilted toward the side of the Reich, the factory of more than 300,000 airplanes. By mid-1943, the German General Staff began to detect that something had changed drastically over the European sky. The reports arriving from France, Belgium, and the Western Reich no longer described sporadic appearances or isolated attacks. What began to take shape in the intelligence reports was a constant flow of long-range aircraft that crossed the Channel without visible obstacles, maintained formation over hundreds of kilometers, and returned to their bases with barely any interference. The magnitude of the phenomenon exceeded any previous prediction. Unlike the British bombings that usually arrived at night, this new wave occurred in broad daylight, with a number of aircraft that had not been seen since the massive exercises of the Luftwaffe itself. Radar observers located in Normandy, Brittany, and Pas-de-Calais began to send messages with a regularity that had not been recorded in years. Every week, new squadrons crossed the skies with a course and discipline unknown until then. At first, it was believed that these were extended British operations, but details soon emerged that disproved that assumption. The formations were composed of planes that did not correspond to any RAF model. The square wings, the double engines, the robust shape, and the specific markings indicated a different origin. For the Luftwaffe technicians, a single visual reconnaissance was enough to confirm the suspicion. They were units coming from American bases, not the United Kingdom. In the first encounters, the ground defenses limited themselves to following the movements without intervening. The coastal anti-aircraft batteries did not know precisely if they had authorization to open fire on targets that did not immediately respond, and the regional command still believed that these were exploratory maneuvers. However, as the weeks passed, it became clear that these flights were not reconnaissance missions. They were heading to industrial zones, railway crossings, and vehicle repair shops in western France. In many cases, the bombings hit targets with a precision that German planners had not seen in other air campaigns. Damage to key infrastructure began to delay shipments of ammunition, fuel, and mechanical parts. The first aircraft to regularly enter the scene were the heavy B-17 bombers, known for their ability to remain stable during high-altitude attacks. In a single operation over Saint-Nazaire, the aircraft crossed the sky in compact formation and returned with barely any losses, despite the artillery response. German commanders were surprised not only by the resistance of the planes, but by the speed with which they reappeared. Every time one wave was repelled, another arrived a few days later, as if the flow of available units had no end. The Luftwaffe, which in previous campaigns had operated with almost total superiority, found itself in an inverse situation. Every interception attempt ended in uneven duels. German fighters could not stay in the air for as long as the enemy bombers, and their number was insufficient to stop entire squadrons arriving from the Atlantic. Furthermore, the new planes came escorted by long-range models that protected the rear, making any effective attack even more difficult. The units stationed in the west began to suffer losses that were previously typical of the Eastern Front. The effects of the change were soon noticed in Berlin. The armament authorities began to receive reports of delays, lack of spare parts, and logistical problems that could not be attributed to sabotage or internal failures. Many of the factories that previously operated without interruptions now suffered shutdowns due to structural damage or the loss of railway connections. Every bombing had visible consequences on the supply chain. Some convoys were cancelled because the lines that supplied them had been destroyed, and others were diverted by longer routes, which increased waiting times and complicated distribution. On the high command maps, vulnerable areas were multiplying. It was no longer about protecting Berlin or Hamburg, but about keeping the loading stations, assembly workshops, and intermediate depots operational. What was once a war on well-defined fronts was turning into a struggle to keep the internal productive infrastructure standing. German planners were forced to redesign transport routes, better distribute reserves, and reduce the concentration of certain goods to avoid greater losses. Factories began to operate with greater discretion, and many moved part of their operations underground. The units responsible for anti-aircraft defense also began to reorganize. Positions near strategic points were reinforced, new watchtowers were erected, and additional cannons were installed in industrial estates. But the speed with which the attacks followed one another exceeded the capacity for reaction. In many cases, the defenses were ready only after the target had already been hit. The enemy acted with a coordination that had not been seen since the stage of greatest German expansion in 1940. The formations were precise, and their impact devastating. The Luftwaffe specialists began to perceive a disturbing change in the evolution of the adversary's air material. The aircraft they encountered in combat were not identical to those seen months before. They incorporated visible modifications in armament, autonomy, and navigation systems. This constant succession of adjustments demonstrated that the enemy industry was not only manufacturing in large numbers, but was also rapidly renewing its designs. For German technicians, accustomed to long processes dependent on exhaustive testing, it was surprising to verify how American plants introduced improvements almost immediately, while simultaneously maintaining the regularity of their deliveries. This scenario even affected the internal language of the German command. Terms like air superiority began to be replaced by more defensive expressions. Instead of talking about control of the sky, reports focused on the need to mitigate damage, reduce losses, or guarantee operational continuity. In internal memorandums, a clear transition from offense to containment was noted. The confidence of previous stages had given way to a constant management of emergencies. Commanders began to receive directives focused on avoiding the collapse of logistics instead of maintaining air positions. One of the points that most disconcerted German analysts was the apparent lack of interruption between attacks. While in other wars the bombings were followed by weeks of pause, the Americans maintained an almost uninterrupted frequency. The existence of multiple operational bases, both in Great Britain and in other points in southern England, allowed a pace that challenged any prediction. The reports were no longer written to describe isolated events, but were lists of weekly damage, where each bombed city appeared next to 2 or 3 others that had been attacked on the same day or the day before. Faced with that reality, the Luftwaffe began to move squadrons from other fronts to reinforce the west. But every unit that moved meant leaving another sector without cover, and tactical decisions became increasingly difficult. Resources were insufficient, and the enemy seemed to anticipate every movement. The German Air Command understood that the threat was no longer a hypothesis, but an installed routine. And while the radars recorded the humming of engines in the distance, a question began to arise in Berlin that few wanted to formulate. How much longer could they resist? During the first months of 1944, the flights of American bombers were no longer isolated or surprising events. Formations of 4 engines crossed the skies in broad daylight, with trajectories as predictable as unwavering. German air defense installations began to saturate, and although the number of anti-aircraft batteries increased, their effectiveness diminished due to the growing volume of incursions. Each wave left visible damage in the industrial centers, but the real attrition accumulated beneath the surface, in the supply network, in the fatigue of the workers, and in the fragmentation of the chain of command. The problem was not only in the firepower that the planes brought with them, but in the consistency with which they returned. It was no longer about facing a specific offensive, but about trying to contain a tide that did not stop. Every time the sky cleared, the radars detected new formations on the way. The alarms became routine. Civilians learned to recognize the hum of the engines long before the authorities confirmed the alert. Factories began to operate under reinforced roofs, if they were not moved underground. Some even hid among common buildings to avoid being priority targets. As the Allied offensive intensified, German combat squadrons faced increasing difficulties in remaining operational. New recruits arrived at the units without adequate technical training, partly due to the haste with which instruction cycles were completed and the lack of access to effective simulators. Military academies no longer had the personnel or the minimum resources to guarantee complete training, and many key tasks were left in the hands of aspirants who had barely completed the initial preparation stage. At the same time, veteran pilots who still remained in service accumulated missions without rest, dragging fatigue, minor injuries, and a constant pressure that began to be reflected in the general performance of operations. The coordination between regional commands also deteriorated. Communication systems were overloaded, and decisions were made late. Many times the fighters took off when the bombers had already retreated. On other occasions, German squadrons were sent to incorrect locations where there were no targets to intercept. The losses did not come only from combat, but from operational inefficiency and the accelerated wear and tear of the available aircraft. Meanwhile, the Americans maintained a constant flow of replacements, both men and machines, which arrived from across the ocean in quantities that Germany could not match. The attack routes also diversified. Incursions were no longer limited to arms factories, but aimed at railway junctions, power plants, communication centers, and any point that served as logistical support. This forced Germany to disperse its defense network and redistribute resources to unforeseen areas. The feeling of vulnerability spread. Even areas far from the front began to receive hits. Sirens stopped being an urban phenomenon to become part of the soundscape in small towns as well. Commanders who still retained the capacity for analysis began to assume that air dominance was no longer on their side. The problem was not technical. In many specific battles, German fighters still demonstrated agility and maneuverability. What overcame them was the quantity, the frequency, and the organization with which the Americans operated. The bombings were coordinated with long-range escorts, well-armed and with solid training. Each incursion was protected by layers of air cover that made it extremely risky to approach the formations without suffering immediate casualties. The direct consequence was an internal reformulation of priorities. The Reich stopped seeking air superiority and began to focus its efforts on defensive measures. Anti-aircraft trenches were reinforced, searchlights were installed, protection balloons were multiplied, and the use of ground radars was intensified. However, none of that compensated for the loss of initiative. For the first time, the High Command assumed that it could not prevent the attacks from occurring. It only tried to reduce their impact. This change in mentality affected the entire military structure. The discourse shifted from projecting offensives to resisting internally. The civilian population, exposed to constant danger, began to develop new ways of adaptation. Cities implemented staggered evacuation plans, underground shelters became everyday spaces, and working hours were adjusted to enemy flight patterns. The entire country seemed to revolve around the actions of a force operating from the air. The feeling that territorial control no longer guaranteed security grew. The army could maintain its positions on the ground, but that did not prevent fire from falling from the sky regularly and precisely. Official propaganda tried to maintain the fighting spirit, highlighting isolated victories and minimizing the damage suffered. However, technical reports showed a different reality. Arms production began to suffer. Some parts could not be assembled due to a lack of components that could not be transported. Trains stopped on routes interrupted by craters, and repairs took days instead of hours. In the industrial complexes, the plant managers no longer spoke of meeting goals, but of avoiding collapse. Each new bombing required starting from scratch in some section. The transport network was one of the most affected sectors. Destroyed locomotives not only hindered the movement of troops, but also the internal supply of coal, steel, and food. Road routes were not enough to compensate for the losses. Available trucks were diverted to the Eastern Front, where the winter and mud quickly rendered them useless. In the end, internal logistics became fragile. Each journey required advanced planning, improvised detours, and armed escorts. The simple act of moving a generator or a turbine could take weeks. Demoralization in the air defense units also grew. Many operators knew that their shots would not change the course of the incursions. Batteries overheated, parts wore out, and the number of targets exceeded the real capabilities. Despite individual effort, the feeling was that none of it was enough. Even among the most veteran officers, the discourse was no longer about victory, but about containment. Each day without total destruction was considered a success. In the midst of that accumulated attrition, the American military apparatus maintained its advance. Each week, new units, new pilots, and new airplane models were incorporated. The American factories had reached a rhythm where replacements arrived before the loss was noticed. This fluidity contrasted with the German rigidity. Orders were delayed, resources were fragmented, and plans were constantly being rewritten. There was no stable line of action. Every reaction was circumstantial, based on immediate emergencies and not on a coherent strategy. The chain attacks also generated a secondary effect. They forced Germany to dedicate more and more human resources to internal defense. This meant subtracting personnel from other fronts, reducing offensive contingents, and altering expansion plans. The main cities absorbed entire divisions just to maintain surveillance, operate radars, repair runways, and guard key installations. The war began to be a battle of internal attrition as well. The enemy was no longer only on the borders, but within the everyday sky. When the year advanced toward summer, the German military commands understood that control of the air no longer belonged to them. Decisions were no longer made with the thought of advancing, but of surviving. Each new day of clear skies was a threat. The sirens continued to sound, the shadows of the plains multiplied, and the echo of the explosions was the new language that defined the rhythm of the war in their own territory. The Luftwaffe suffocated in its own territory. While the skies of Europe began to fill with an increasing number of enemy aircraft, within Germany the pressure on factories and workshops became constant. The facilities dedicated to aviation ranged from small improvised centers to complete industrial complexes, but no structure seemed capable of sustaining the growing demand for replacements, adjustments, and new models. With each passing week, the Luftwaffe saw its stocks diminish, while the Americans, thousands of kilometers away, managed to supply their European bases with a speed that left German technicians perplexed. In the heart of German industry, the need for engines, propellers, and spare parts exceeded the daily production capacity. The scarcity of strategic materials, added to the constant bombings over the Reich territory, slowed down all processes. Workers toiled against the clock, often with intermittent electricity, without knowing whether the following day would bring functional machines or whether the air raid sirens would again interrupt the shifts. Many assembly centers had been moved underground or dispersed into forests, but that fragmentation further complicated logistical coordination. Meanwhile, from well-stocked bases in England and North Africa, American bombers took off daily. They flew in formation, protected by fighters with extended range, and dropped tons of explosives on industrial zones that no longer had sufficient air defenses. The Luftwaffe tried to organize responses, but human and technical losses made it impossible to maintain effective cover. Every plane shot down meant days of delay in a system that was already operating below the necessary minimum. Some officials tried to reorganize the improvised warehouses, looking for ways to make disparate parts compatible or adapt remnants of obsolete models, but the results were irregular. The lack of detailed inventory and specific parts caused frequent interruptions, with no possibility of anticipating when production would resume. In contrast, reports from the other side spoke of stable supply chains, where every order found an immediate response from integrated plants that maintained their pace without pause. As the internal situation deteriorated, the German high commands began to modify their priorities. The idea of mass production was displaced by the attempt to manufacture increasingly advanced and technical aircraft, as if technological superiority could compensate for numerical inferiority. However, the new models required months of design, multiple testing phases, and highly qualified personnel who were scarcer than ever. What left the factories, when it did, arrived late and in quantities that made no real tactical difference. Reports from the front only confirmed the gravity of the situation. Air defense units constantly requested spare parts that never arrived on time, and the few new planes received could not be kept operational for more than a few days due to lack of adequate maintenance. The need to improvise solutions on the ground led to absurd scenes. Squadrons sharing the same spare parts among themselves, technicians dismantling one engine to try to repair another, commanders sending messages requesting parts from regions that no longer existed on the military map. In American territory, the production capacity reached a level that disconcerted German observers. Reports spoke of plants where processes were so integrated that an aircraft could go from the initial assembly phase to the flight test in surprisingly short lapses. What was most striking was not only the speed, but the regularity with which new batches of aircraft left, without prolonged interruptions or visible bottlenecks. This continuity contrasted with the rigidity of German industry, which was forced to stop entire shifts due to a lack of parts or damage to infrastructure. The German authorities began to detect a new operational disadvantage when they evaluated the time it took their own aircraft to return to the air after a mission. The accumulation of logistical delays, lack of specific tools, and scarcity of qualified technical personnel meant that many aircraft remained inactive for days. Some units even had to cannibalize parts between squadrons to maintain at least an operational fraction. In that context, the impossibility of sustaining a continuous rhythm of deployment prevented regular planning of air responses and left wide sectors without effective coverage. The deterioration of the German logistical network also began to be noticed in the capacity to sustain its static defense systems. Anti-aircraft units, which depended on a constant flow of components and technical supplies, were forced to operate with incomplete equipment and with very reduced levels of operability. In several attacked locations, the surveillance points were deactivated by simple exhaustion of human and material resources, with no possibility of replacement. The internal routes, collapsed by the constant circulation of retreating divisions and columns of displaced civilians, no longer allowed prioritizing the transfer of equipment intended to protect critical infrastructure. This left wide areas of the interior of the country without effective coverage, just when it was most needed. Furthermore, the idea of decentralizing production, which had been seen as a solution, ended up generating more problems. By operating in remote and poorly protected locations, small workshops failed to maintain homogeneous quality or meet the demands of the central command. The planes left with factory defects, and last-minute adjustments were often required, which meant more time losses. Coordination between departments became almost impossible, and many decisions were made blindly, without real information from the field or the capacity for rapid response. The distance between what was needed and what was achieved in delivery became an increasingly difficult gap to close. The German system tried to force production by imposing rhythms that could not be met. Shifts were extended, immediate results were demanded, forced laborers without technical preparation were used, but the problem was not in the will, but in the structure itself. What was once a centralized, efficient and disciplined mechanism was turning into a disorganized network that survived by inertia. In this context, the morale of the technicians and workers also began to deteriorate. The feeling of powerlessness was shared at all levels. Although some centers still managed to deliver acceptable products, most operated with the bare minimum. The constant comparison with the enemy, who seemed to have inexhaustible resources, only accentuated the hopelessness. Many knew that, even in optimal conditions, they could no longer reach the pace set by the other side. In parallel, the Air Command began to lose the capacity for long-term planning. Decisions were made based on immediate emergencies, and every error implied days of delay. There was no longer talk of strategic offensives, but of specific resistances, logistical patches, technical salvage operations. What was once a national aviation system had been reduced to a set of dispersed reactions with no clear direction or defined horizon. During the spring of 1944, the offices in Berlin began to fill with reports that showed a pattern impossible to hide. With each passing month, American production figures far exceeded any previous calculation. The planners compared tables and discovered that, while Germany barely managed to maintain the level of deliveries, the United States multiplied the number of assembled aircraft by 3 or 4. That difference was not temporary, nor the result of statistical errors. It was a reality that began to be felt on every front, in every delayed convoy, and in every squadron that received mission orders without having enough planes ready to take off. The impact of that gap became evident in daily operations. In France, the squadrons in charge of protecting railway lines encountered new formations of enemy bombers every week. Even when they managed to shoot down 10 aircraft, the magnitude of the attack remained intact. By the time the losses were counted, another wave was on the way. The German effort was worn down in a dynamic that no longer offered breaks. The enemy seemed to have an uninterrupted flow of planes and crews, and that abundance made the partial victories achieved with enormous sacrifices irrelevant. Within the Luftwaffe, the pressure generated increasing tensions among commands. Some demanded concentrating the defense on a few critical regions, while others insisted on maintaining broad coverage. The result was a fragmentation of resources that weakened overall effectiveness. By dispersing, the fighters could not gather the necessary mass to oppose the enemy formations. Each air combat ended in a bleeding of experienced pilots, while replacements fresh out of training were unable to sustain the rhythm. The human losses, combined with the fatigue of the remaining aircraft, accelerated the crisis of the German Air Force. In the workshops, the lack of coordination aggravated the problems. Many factories did not have access to the appropriate raw materials and used substitutes that reduced the durability of the parts. The engines delivered lasted less, the wings supported less weight, and the fuselages were deformed after a few hours of flight. Improvisation was the norm, but that resource was no longer enough. Every defective plane represented hours of wasted work, and men sent into combat with insufficient means. Meanwhile, reports from England described hangars full of newly produced aircraft ready to cross the Channel when the order arrived. The psychological effect of this difference extended beyond the military sphere. The civilian population, subjected to daily bombings, saw how official propaganda lagged behind tangible evidence. Communiques spoke of victories, but the cities showed ruins, blocked streets and paralyzed factories. Citizens understood that the attacks were occurring with greater frequency and that their own response was increasingly weak. That perception, accumulated day after day, eroded confidence in the authorities and fueled the feeling that the end could no longer be avoided. In the Reich's technical offices, desperate solutions were attempted. Jet airplane projects were accelerated and resources were allocated to experimental designs. However, those models required development time, mechanical adjustments, and a stable production network that no longer existed. The promises of new weapons failed to compensate for the daily loss of conventional units. Every week, the figures showed more losses than replacements, and the gap with the adversary widened irreversibly. At the same time, the industrial infrastructure remained a priority target. Attacks by long-range bombers struck steel mills, chemical plants, and electrical centers. Production chains suffered severe cuts, and response times were no longer able to compensate for the accumulated damage. Engineers and workers faced obstacles that grew with each passing day, from power outages to machinery failures due to unreplaced parts. Although a production line was sometimes resumed, the general instability turned every advance into a precarious achievement. In contrast, American factories remained intact, protected by distance and fueled by practically unlimited resources. The railway routes also began to collapse. Every destroyed bridge, every burned station, represented days of delay in the delivery of coal, steel, or mechanical parts. Train circulation was reduced to a minimum, and road transport could not absorb the additional load. Trucks were scarce, fuel even more so, and the roads were under constant air surveillance. Every transfer of material became a risk of total loss. That logistical fragility further reduced the industry's ability to sustain a war effort that required precision and regularity. The accumulation of obstacles led the commands themselves to recognize the inability to compete on equal terms. Internal meetings no longer discussed how to regain the initiative, but how to prolong the resistance. Strategic plans spoke of delaying the inevitable, of holding out long enough to negotiate on better terms. The military language, which in the early years was filled with offensives and conquests, transformed into defensive terms: preserve, resist, hold out. The contrast with the enemy, who spoke of expansion, advance, and supremacy, was evident. The practical consequences of this transformation were seen in the daily lives of the combatants. Pilots returning from interception missions described unequal engagements, where each of their own shoot-downs was overshadowed by the magnitude of the formation that remained intact. Mechanics, who previously celebrated every successful repair, now knew that any ready-to-fly aircraft could fall in a matter of hours. Civilians, who had learned to rebuild quickly after each attack, faced the impossibility of remaking what was destroyed when the bombings were repeated at too short intervals. The Reich had bet on centralization and short-term efficiency, but it found itself facing an adversary who based their strategy on abundance and continuity. That difference in models became insurmountable. The North Americans could lose dozens of aircraft in a single mission and replace them in a matter of days. Germany, on the other hand, took weeks to produce a minimum quantity of units that barely compensated for the losses. The calculation was simple and devastating. Each month of war strengthened the enemy and weakened the Reich. Towards the end of that year, the German commands understood that their own industry had reached its limit. It was not a matter of lack of will or organization. It was the weight of an arithmetical reality. The industrial scale of the United States widely surpassed any attempt at a response. The skies were filling with aircraft that overwhelmed the defenses, and every blow against German factories deepened a collapse that already seemed irreversible. The Luftwaffe, once the regime's pride, was reduced to a shadow of what it had been, unable to guarantee even minimal protection of the airspace. Under these conditions, the German General Staff was forced to accept that the industrial pace of its adversary was unattainable. The entire country, from the factories to the fronts, operated under a principle of continuous attrition that undermined the possibilities of resistance every day. The sky had become enemy territory, and the German war machine, designed for fast, offensive wars, was trapped in a confrontation that depended on sustained production capacity. Faced with that dynamic, the possibilities of victory disappeared, and only the slow crumbling of a system that could no longer keep pace remained. Normandy, the day Germany was overwhelmed on the coast. When the first daylight began to filter over the French coast, the situation was already alarming for those guarding the Western Front. The German defences installed on the beaches of Normandy showed signs of wear after nights of uninterrupted bombing. On land, the infantry soldiers, most of them young men without previous experience, tried to reorganize their positions between improvised trenches, collapsed ditches, and cracked fortifications. The echo of the engines roaring above their heads left no room for doubt. The day would not bring calm. The first reports intercepted at the command posts warned of an increase in naval activity off the coast. From the heights, only a blurry line could be distinguished on the horizon, but the commanders knew what it meant. Reconnaissance divisions sent to the cliffs confirmed the presence of Allied vessels approaching in close formation. Every minute that passed increased the certainty that a massive landing was approaching. At the German command posts, encrypted messages, contradictory orders, and tense silences followed one another. There were no immediate reinforcements, only the order to resist. In the machine gun nests hidden among the rocks, the operators checked the mechanisms with trembling hands. Many of them had been without sleep for days, constantly relocated due to the threat of air attacks. Although the positions were armed with medium-caliber artillery pieces, ammunition was limited, and the supply lines were partially cut off by the night incursions of Allied bombers. When the first landing craft touched down, shots began from the casemates, attempting to stop the advance before they took the first meters of beach. The soldiers who were defending the direct accesses to the coast knew that the armoured vehicles were held several kilometres from the shore. The orders to deploy the Panzer tanks were delayed, since only the High Command could authorise their movement, and there was not yet official confirmation that this was the main invasion. That costly wait left the troops stationed facing the sea isolated, forced to face the first impact of the Allied operation alone. Meanwhile, Allied projectiles fell regularly on the access roads, making any attempt at immediate reorganization almost impossible. In the interior, the German platoons stationed in the nearby towns received fragmented news. Some liaison officers traveled by motorcycle under air fire to transmit verbal directives due to the partial collapse of radio communications. In many villages, columns of smoke mixed with the dust of the ruined buildings, while local inhabitants tried to flee toward the countryside. For the German commands, that confusion added an extra layer of uncertainty. They did not know whether the enemy troops would manage to penetrate deeply, or if it was a distraction maneuver like the many they had already faced months before. As the hours passed, the reports confirmed that the landing was not a limited attack. From the German point of view, the most disconcerting thing was not the ferocity of the advance, but the unending quantity of vehicles, artillery, and soldiers that continued to arrive in successive waves. The resistance from the coastal batteries partially managed to slow down the landing in some sectors, but the volume of the Allied deployment quickly overwhelmed any local effort. The most experienced officers began to assume that they were facing a definitive offensive, although not all dared to openly recognize it. The units that managed to withdraw from the direct line of fire tried to regroup at secondary points. Some battalions retreated towards small elevations to establish containment defenses. In these spaces, confrontations multiplied with paratroopers already deployed inland during the early morning. Brief but intense clashes occurred on the rural roads, where the Germans, without air support or immediate armoured reinforcements, were at a disadvantage. Tactical decisions were made by intermediate commands with very little precise information, which led to erratic movements and unnecessary losses. In the air, the situation was even more serious. Allied fighters and bombers dominated the sky, preventing any attempt at visible mobilization during the day. Every grouping or convoy was easily detected and attacked from the air with great precision. On the roads, German soldiers moved in small groups, camouflaged among the vegetation, crossing fields on foot to avoid the main routes. Physical exhaustion accumulated with every kilometer, and morale crumbled with every new attack. German coordination centers tried to maintain control of the scattered forces throughout the region. Calls for help multiplied, but the answers were always the same: hold position, stop the advance, and wait for reinforcements. In some sectors, heavy artillery managed to temporarily stop columns of enemy tanks, though at the cost of quickly exhausting their own resources. Without the possibility of effective air resupply or evacuation, many units were trapped in exposed positions. In the towns, house-to-house fighting left streets turned into ruins and soldiers disoriented by the lack of clear information. In the midst of the chaos, some German commanders remained convinced that the Allies were concentrating their resources only on that front, and that another attack would soon come through a different point, perhaps in the north. That conviction, encouraged by Allied disinformation campaigns in previous weeks, still maintained doubt about the true magnitude of the assault. That strategic uncertainty paralyzed critical decisions. The fear of moving the main reserves for a threat that might still not be the definitive one limited the reactions of the General Staff. Meanwhile, the losses accumulated. Many German positions were abandoned without receiving new orders, simply because the men were isolated or out of ammunition. In the most affected sectors, the units were reduced to small groups of survivors who moved without a fixed direction, trying to reconnect with some command post. The routes to the interior were blocked or controlled by Allied troops who were expanding rapidly, cutting off lines of retreat and enclosing entire companies in rural areas without the possibility of escape. The pressure was constant and worsened with each dawn. The German forces were not only losing ground, but also operational capacity. The lack of coordination between army branches, the dispersion of resources, and the enemy's technological superiority turned the battlefield into an environment with no room for maneuver. Each attempt at reorganization was followed by a new bombing, a new ambush, a new deployment of enemy troops who already dominated the terrain with detailed maps and uninterrupted logistical support. In that scenario, the everyday transformed into an hour-by-hour struggle for survival. On the intermediate lines, where neither orders nor news from the front arrived, soldiers ate scarce rations under fallen trees, slept in abandoned barns, and took turns watching phantom roads from which no one returned. The war was no longer perceived as a campaign of strategic advances, but as a sequence of endless days where the priority was not to disappear. The continuous pressure on the front began to wear down the troops' determination. The soldiers, trained under the premise of a disciplined and efficient force, saw how each day became more uncertain and exhausting. The enemy's material superiority imposed a rhythm that rendered many resistance attempts useless. As losses accumulated and control of the terrain diminished, the notion of a viable counteroffensive faded. The defense no longer responded to strategic logic, but to the immediate need to stay alive and avoid total collapse. The difference in means left few options. Despite the courage shown by many units that resisted until the end, the adversary's superiority weighed on every combat. The fall of the main defensive positions opened the way for deeper penetration, where German troops faced the real possibility of being completely surrounded. For many, the only thing left was to retreat toward areas still under partial control, always under fire, with no certainty of finding shelter. The price of underestimating the USA. As the airspace became impassable and armored formations were stalled by constant pressure from above, an unavoidable diagnosis began to take hold at the highest levels of command. The military and economic structure of the Reich was entering an irreversible phase of exhaustion. The defensive lines yielded successively, but the most alarming thing was the silent collapse of the infrastructure that was supposed to sustain them. Many factory complexes had reduced their activity to minimum levels. The supply of strategic materials became unpredictable, and key railway corridors were blocked or unusable. What was once a vigorous framework of intensive production was now transforming into a landscape of deserted workshops, stopped tools, and truncated communications. The lack of steel was not a temporary exception, but a structural symptom. The cargo trains that once transported ingots, plates, and coal from the eastern mines no longer arrived. The bombings on the railway lines, fuel depots, and railway classification centres had created a permanent bottleneck. The factories that still had workers lacked basic materials, and when these arrived, they did so late, poorly distributed, or in ridiculous quantities. The entire system was overwhelmed by an economy that had been designed for a short conflict and had prolonged beyond any initial forecast. In some factory sectors, reports began to appear about increasing mismatches between declared production figures and what was actually delivered to the front. Assembly deadlines were extended without prior notice, and many lines operated below the minimum threshold due to logistical detours and intermittent power outages. Added to this were failures in coordination between regional plants, which caused unforeseen bottlenecks. The complete chain, from the order of components to the final delivery, showed signs of accumulated fatigue that escaped the control of the regime's planners. In parallel, the Luftwaffe suffered a hemorrhage of pilots, planes, and fuel. Training was increasingly shorter, and inexperienced young men were sent on impossible missions. Aviation fuel was stored in smaller quantities and rationed, with priority given to units that never managed to take off. Engines overheated, spare parts were scarce, and mechanics worked with tools reused dozens of times. Maintenance centers suffered constant interruptions, without real protection from enemy attacks, which prevented any sustained repair. On the Eastern Front, the consequences of this structural weakness were even more visible. Units received impossible orders to hold positions without reinforcements, without adequate ammunition, without spare artillery pieces or fuel for transport. Divisions returning from the front did so in critical condition, with half of their vehicles broken down, without sanitary trucks, and with little food. In repair centers, engines could not be dismantled due to lack of cranes, calibrated tools, or simply because there was no electricity to keep the facilities running. Candles and flashlights replaced industrial floodlights. German production figures that seemed impressive in the first years of the conflict looked ridiculous compared to the logistical statistics of the United States. While the Germans struggled to complete the delivery of 500 tanks per month, the Americans exceeded 3,000 units, with guaranteed engines, spare parts, and fuel. Allied convoys moved these vehicles from the ports of Africa to northern Europe without interruption. Each ship disembarked hundreds of tons of supplies on beaches turned into temporary terminals that operated with surgical efficiency. Reports obtained at the interrogation centers showed a common pattern among prisoners from Normandy and Italy. All agreed in describing an enemy system capable of sustaining its troops with a level of supply unknown to them. They mentioned the constant arrival of supplies, from varied provisions to office equipment, as well as the immediate availability of technical spare parts in the middle of a campaign. In contrast, they recounted that in their own ranks it was common to improvise with civilian materials, reuse documents, or share minimal rations, which made the difference in preparation between both armies even more evident. In the occupied areas of the Reich, factories worked in increasingly precarious conditions. Allied bombings not only destroyed roofs and walls, but also electrical grids, hydraulic systems, and entire warehouses. Workers slept in underground shelters. Some wounded continued to work shifts to avoid sanctions, and meal breaks were shortened due to lack of food. The authorities tried to maintain production through emergency measures, but the internal supply lines were as collapsed as the external ones. Even when an order arrived from Berlin, its fulfillment was unrealistic. The parts were not available, the molds had been lost, or the necessary machinery had been moved or destroyed. Morale in the industrial centers fell drastically. The workers, many of them forced foreigners, no longer believed in the usefulness of their labor. They knew that the products they assembled would not reach the front in time. Some were sabotaged from within, others abandoned in warehouses that would later be hit by bombs. British intelligence reports indicated that productivity levels in certain areas of the Reich had fallen below 30% compared to the previous year. Workdays were prolonged, but the results were minimal. The effort no longer generated tactical results. In contrast, the American production centers operated with constant precision. The organization of labor, the use of automated machinery, the standardization of parts, and the abundance of resources allowed ships, tanks, jeeps, rifles, uniforms, and spare parts to leave in uninterrupted quantities. Furthermore, these products arrived at their destination accompanied by manuals, repair tools, trained technicians, and spare parts ready to be used. The United States Army not only arrived with weapons, it arrived with an entire infrastructure that ensured its continuous operation. In the reports of the German commands that survived the conflict, a common idea is repeated. They never imagined that the United States would be capable of sustaining an industrial effort of that magnitude for so many years and at such a distance. Many of them confessed that the main error was not military, but one of economic calculation. They had bet on a lightning war because they knew they could not match the resources of their enemies if the conflict was prolonged, and yet they continued to advance as if time played in their favor. German strategic planning did not contemplate that an entire nation could be converted so quickly. It was assumed that the oceanic distance, internal divisions, and the liberal economic model would prevent the United States from maintaining constant production. When they discovered that this was not the case, it was already too late. German factories were vulnerable, their transport lines could not be rebuilt, and both civilian and military morale was fractured. In the prisoner of war camps established by the Allies after the surrender, many German soldiers continued to show astonishment when observing the efficiency of the American facilities. There, meals arrived on time, doctors had modern equipment, and showers worked with hot water. Some soldiers reported that even during captivity they could see columns of American trucks and trains crossing entire regions without obstacles, loaded with provisions, ammunition, and tools. For them, that logistical deployment surpassed everything they had known in their own war experience. At the end of the conflict, interrogations of senior officers revealed a shared view. The collapse was not only due to the military fronts, but to the impossibility of keeping alive an economic machine based on limited resources, vulnerable routes, and obsolete methods. While the Americans could overproduce, repair without pause, and transport on a continental scale, Germany only managed to maintain small pockets of production that went out as soon as they lost their connection to supply routes or suffered an air attack. In some German industrial zones at the end of the war, there were no parts or blueprints left. The facilities had been dismantled, moved, or destroyed. The last attempts at recovery were nullified by the lack of technicians, the loss of communications, and widespread exhaustion. Some improvised solutions were attempted, such as the use of mobile workshops or the transfer of factories to underground tunnels, but the effort was insufficient. The level of devastation did not allow sustained production to be restarted. Every new attempt encountered shortages of fuel, explosives, trained workers, or access to basic tools. The end of the German industrial war was not marked by a great explosion, but was expressed in a succession of silences. Silences in the stopped factories, in the motionless trains, in the military radios without spare parts, in the workshops where the tools no longer turned. That silence was the sound of a power that had believed that war was won with audacity and will, but that never understood that victory required millions of tons, millions of parts, and millions of hands working in synchrony from across the ocean.